The laughter hit her first, sharp and cruel, cutting through the music like a blade through silk. Eleanor Whitfield stood frozen near the tall marble pillar, her borrowed blue gown suddenly feeling like the thinnest armor in the world. Two women in diamonds had just walked past her, whispering loud enough for her to hear every word, loud enough that it was clearly meant to be heard. "Look at her dress. I am certain I saw that same one on Lady Milbourne 2 seasons ago. Poor girl, her father lost everything, and still she comes here pretending to belong." Eleanor kept her eyes forward, her spine straight, refusing to let her face show what those words had done inside her chest. She had learned that lesson a long time ago. A lady never let the room see her bleed. The ballroom of Ashcombe Hall glittered under 1,000 candles, gold light bouncing off crystal chandeliers and polished floors. Musicians played near the far wall, their violins weaving through the crowd like something alive. Couples spun across the floor in perfect rhythm, silk skirts flaring, laughter rising and falling like waves. It was the kind of night people would talk about for weeks. It was the kind of night Eleanor had once dreamed of, back when her family's name still meant something in this city. That had been 3 years ago, before her father's business failed, before their townhouse was sold to pay debts, before the whispers started following her everywhere she went, sharp as needles hidden in silk gloves. She should not have come tonight. She had told her aunt as much, standing in the small sitting room of their rented house, staring at the invitation that had arrived by mistake, addressed to a cousin who could not attend. But her aunt, ever hopeful, had insisted. "One night, Eleanor, one night to remind them who you are." Who she was. Eleanor almost laughed at the thought now, standing alone in a corner while the entire ballroom moved around her like she did not exist. She was nobody here. She was a ghost in a borrowed dress, invisible to everyone except the ones who wanted to remind her exactly how far she had fallen. She pressed her gloved hands together and glanced toward the terrace doors, half open to let in the cool evening air. Perhaps she would slip outside for a moment, away from the heat of the crowd and the weight of every unkind glance. She took one step toward the doors when she noticed a young woman near the refreshment table, fumbling nervously with the hem of her gown, which had come loose at the seam. The girl looked close to tears, glancing around at the crowd as if terrified someone would notice. Eleanor hesitated only a second before walking toward her. "May I help?" she asked gently, kneeling slightly to examine the torn seam without waiting for an answer. The girl blinked at her, startled. "I do not have a needle. I do not know anyone here. I only just arrived in London last week, and I already feel like the whole room is watching me fail." Eleanor smiled, pulling a small pin from the folds of her own gown, one she always kept hidden for exactly such emergencies. Her aunt had taught her that. A lady prepares for disaster quietly and fixes it without ever making a scene. "There," Eleanor said, securing the loose fabric with practiced fingers. "No one will notice a thing now. And for what it is worth, everyone in this room is far too busy worrying about themselves to notice you at all." The girl let out a small, relieved laugh. "Thank you, truly. What is your name?" "Eleanor." "I am Margaret. I hope we shall speak again tonight." Eleanor nodded politely, though she doubted Margaret would remember her once the night's excitement swept her toward brighter company. That was simply how these evenings worked. Kindness was noticed for a moment, then forgotten the instant something more dazzling appeared. She turned back toward the terrace, but a small commotion near the serving table caught her eye. A young footman, barely older than herself, stood pale and trembling as an older butler scolded him under his breath for dropping a tray earlier that evening. The footman's hands shook as he tried to steady a stack of clean glasses, his stomach clearly empty, his face drawn with exhaustion. Eleanor glanced around. No one else seemed to notice him at all, too absorbed in their own conversations and dances. She quietly picked up a small plate of bread and cheese from the edge of the refreshment table and walked toward him. "You look like you could use this more than the guests do," she said softly, placing the plate near his station where he could reach it without anyone seeing. The footman's eyes widened in surprise. "Miss, I could not possibly." "No one is watching," Alina said with a small, reassuring smile. Eat quickly, you will feel steadier. She did not wait for his thanks. She simply walked on, back toward the shadows near the terrace, where she could breathe without being watched, without being judged, without being reminded every few minutes of everything she had lost. She did not know that someone had been watching her the entire time. He stood near the far wall, half hidden behind a group of gentlemen discussing horses and politics, a glass of wine untouched in his hand. He wore a plain gray coat, without a single medal or ornament to mark his rank, nothing that would draw attention in a room full of peacocks dressed in their finest feathers. He preferred it that way. He had spent the better part of 6 years avoiding exactly this kind of gathering, and tonight he had only come because his oldest friend had begged him to make an appearance, if only to remind society that the reclusive Duke of Ravensmore still existed. He had planned to stay for less than an hour, long enough to be seen, to satisfy the obligation, and then to disappear before anyone could trap him in conversation about marriage prospects or business ventures, or the tragedy that had driven him from society in the first place. But then he had noticed her. A young woman in a faded blue gown, standing alone while the rest of the room swirled around her like she was invisible. He had watched as 2 women mocked her dress just loud enough to wound, and he had felt something tighten in his chest, an old familiar anger at cruelty dressed up as elegance. He had watched her straighten her spine and walk away without a single tear, without a single word of defense, simply absorbing the insult and moving forward as though it had not touched her at all. Then he had watched her kneel to fix a stranger's torn hem with a pin she had clearly hidden for herself. He had watched her quietly feed an exhausted footman without expecting a single word of gratitude in return. She did not know anyone was watching. She had not done it to be seen. She had done it simply because it needed doing, and something about that simple, unnoticed kindness struck him harder than anything he had witnessed in this room in years. He found himself moving before he had fully decided to. She was standing near the terrace doors when he approached, close enough that the candlelight caught the loose strands of her dark hair, close enough that he could see the tiredness behind her calm expression, the kind of tiredness that came not from one bad night, but from years of holding herself together in rooms that did not want her. "You are the only interesting person in this entire ballroom," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Alina turned, startled, her heart jumping at the unexpected voice so close beside her. She found herself looking up at a tall man with steady gray eyes and an unreadable expression, his plain coat marking him as someone of no particular importance among the glittering crowd. She did not recognize him. She was certain she had never seen him before in her life. "I beg your pardon," she said, her voice guarded, prepared for another cruel joke dressed up as flattery. "I have been watching this room for the better part of an hour," he said simply. "Everyone here is performing, laughing too loudly at jokes that are not funny, complimenting gowns they secretly envy, pretending to enjoy conversations that bore them senseless. You are the only person tonight who has done anything real." Alina's cheeks warmed, unsure whether to feel flattered or suspicious. "You do not know me, sir. You cannot possibly know what is real and what is performance." "I know you gave your last pin to a stranger's torn hem," he said. "I know you fed a starving footman without expecting a single word of thanks. I know you have been insulted twice tonight and have not allowed a single tear to fall. That is not performance, that is character." She stared at him, momentarily speechless. No one had ever spoken to her this way before, certainly not a stranger in a crowded ballroom who seemed to see straight through every careful wall she had built around herself. "Who are you?" she asked finally. He smiled just slightly, something warm flickering behind those steady gray eyes. "Adrian." Just Adrian, no surname, no title, no mention of family or fortune, the way every other gentleman in this room seemed desperate to announce within the first 10 seconds of conversation. She found something oddly comforting in that simplicity. "Alina," she offered in return. "Alina," he repeated, as though testing the shape of it. "It suits you far better than the whispers I overheard earlier tonight." Her breath caught slightly at the reminder. "You heard that?" "I did," And I thought it was the cruelest kind of foolishness, to judge a woman by the thread of her gown rather than the strength of her spine. Alina did not know how to respond to that. Kindness, when it came from strangers, always felt suspicious to her now, like a door that might slam shut the moment she leaned too far into it. And yet something about the steadiness in his voice, the quiet certainty in his gaze, made her want to believe him, if only for tonight. The music shifted behind them, the violins sliding into a slower, sweeter melody as couples began gathering once more on the dance floor. Adrian glanced toward the crowd, then back at her, and extended his hand. "Dance with me," he said. The words landed like a small shock through her chest. She glanced down at his outstretched hand, then up at his face, searching for some hint of mockery, some sign that this was simply another cruel game dressed in a gentleman's polite manners. "I do not think that is wise," she said carefully. "I am not dressed for attention tonight, and I have no wish to become the subject of further whispers." "Then let them whisper," Adrian said simply. "Whispers cannot touch you unless you allow them to, and I promise you, Alina, I have no interest in games. I only wish for one dance, with the one honest person in this entire room." She hesitated, her heart pounding somewhere between fear and something else entirely, something warmer and more dangerous than fear. She thought of the whispers behind her back, the borrowed gown, the years of feeling invisible in rooms exactly like this one. And then she thought of the way this stranger had looked at her, not with pity, not with mockery, but with something that felt disturbingly close to respect. Slowly, she placed her gloved hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and steady, and something in her chest loosened just slightly, like a knot she had not realized she was carrying finally beginning to ease. He led her toward the edge of the dance floor, and as the music swelled around them, Alina felt every eye in the room somehow drift toward the two of them, though she could not begin to understand why a plain gentleman in a gray coat would draw such sudden attention. She did not know, not yet, that the man holding her hand was no ordinary gentleman at all. She only knew that for the first time in 3 long years, standing in a ballroom full of people who had looked straight through her all night, someone had finally seen her. And she had absolutely no idea how much that single dance was about to change everything. The moment their hands touched, and the music carried them into the first slow turn, Alina became aware of something strange happening around her. Conversations near the edge of the dance floor seemed to falter. Heads turned, one after another, like a ripple spreading across still water. Fans stopped mid-air. Even the musicians, usually so absorbed in their instruments, cast quick glances toward the couple gliding across the polished floor. Alina felt her cheeks flush with confusion. Why is everyone staring? Adrian's mouth curved into the faintest smile, as though he found the question genuinely amusing. "Perhaps they are simply admiring your dancing." "That is not it, and you know it," she said, narrowing her eyes slightly even as he turned her smoothly beneath the chandelier's golden light. "You said your name was Adrian, nothing more. Yet the room reacts as though a king has walked among them." "Then let the room wonder," he said lightly, guiding her through the next turn with an ease that told her he had done this 1,000 times before, though something in his posture suggested he rarely enjoyed it as much as he seemed to be enjoying it now. "Tonight, I would rather speak of you than of myself." Alina exhaled slowly, deciding to let the mystery rest for the moment, if only because the warmth of his hand at her waist and the steadiness of his gaze made it strangely easy to forget the rest of the room entirely. "Very well," she said. "What would you like to know?" "Everything," he said simply. "Start with what you were reading before you came here tonight." The question caught her off guard. No one at these gatherings had ever asked her about books. They asked about her family's misfortune, or whispered about her gown, or ignored her entirely. No one had ever wanted to know what filled her mind when the candles burned low and the house grew quiet. "A collection of old sea voyages," she admitted. "My father used to read them to me when I was young, before everything changed. There is one about a ship that sails past the edge of every known map, simply because the captain refuses to believe the world ends where everyone tells him it does." And do you believe that, Adrian asked, that the world does not end where we are told it does? Elinor considered the question seriously, surprised by how easily it came, how naturally the words formed without the guarded caution she usually wrapped around herself in rooms like this one. I believe people decide where their own world ends long before they ever reach the edge of it. Society tells us where our boundaries lie, and most of us simply accept it and stop walking. But not you. I do not have the luxury of stopping, she said, a touch of dry humor slipping into her voice despite herself. When you have nothing left to lose, walking forward becomes considerably less frightening. Something shifted in his expression then, softened, as though her words had touched a place he rarely allowed anyone near. I lost someone I loved very much some years ago, he said quietly. For a long time afterward, I stopped walking entirely. I told myself the world had ended, and I saw no reason to prove otherwise. Elinor's chest tightened with an unexpected ache. What changed? He held her gaze a moment longer than was strictly proper, the music swelling gently around them as though giving them room to speak without the rest of the world listening. Tonight, perhaps. She did not know how to respond to that, so she said nothing at all, simply allowing the dance to carry them both through another slow turn beneath the candlelight. She told him about her mother, who had passed when Elinor was 12, and about the small garden behind their old townhouse where she used to grow herbs before the house was sold to strangers. She told him about her aunt, who had taken her in without complaint despite having little enough for herself, and about the quiet ache of watching her father grow smaller and more silent with each passing year, weighed down by debts he never spoke of aloud. Adrian listened the way few people ever had, without interrupting, without offering hollow comfort, simply absorbing every word as though it mattered, as though she mattered. You carry a great deal, he said finally, for someone so young. So does everyone in this room, she said. The difference is, most of them have learned to hide it behind better dresses. He laughed then, a real laugh, low and warm, and something in Elinor's chest loosened further still, some old guarded thing finally beginning to unclench after years of careful tension. Across the room, near the refreshment table, a woman in emerald silk watched the pair with narrowed eyes. Lady Cordelia Marsh had spent 3 seasons attempting to secure the attention of every eligible gentleman of consequence in London, and she had spent the better part of tonight hoping to finally corner the elusive stranger in grey, whom she had recognized the moment he arrived, though he clearly wished to remain unrecognized. She had watched him avoid conversation with every ambitious mother and hopeful daughter in the room, only to walk directly toward the one woman in Ashcombe Hall wearing last season's gown. "Who is that girl?" Cordelia murmured to her companion, her voice sharp with barely concealed irritation, dancing with him as though she belongs there. Her companion, a younger woman named Louisa, glanced toward the dance floor and shrugged. "I believe her name is Elinor Whitfield. Her father lost his fortune some years ago. I am surprised she was even permitted an invitation." Cordelia's eyes narrowed further as she watched the stranger lean close to whisper something that made Elinor laugh, a genuine, unguarded laugh that lit her entire face in a way no amount of jewelry ever could. Something about the sight of it settled into Cordelia's chest like a splinter, small and sharp, and impossible to ignore. "We shall see how long that lasts," Cordelia said quietly, more to herself than to Louisa, before turning away with a tight, practiced smile. Back on the dance floor, the music began winding toward its final notes, the violins slowing into a gentler rhythm that signaled the dance was nearly finished. Elinor felt an unexpected pang of disappointment at the realization, surprised by how quickly the evening had transformed from misery into something she desperately did not want to end. "I never asked your surname," she said as the final notes faded, and the dancers around them began to bow and curtsy to one another. Adrian held her gaze a moment longer, something unreadable flickering behind his steady gray eyes. "Perhaps it is better for tonight that you do not know it." "That sounds very much like the beginning of a secret," Elinor said, half teasing, half genuinely curious. "Perhaps it is," he admitted. But I promise you, Alina, it is not the beginning of a lie." Before she could ask what he meant, a gentleman appeared at his side, murmuring something urgent into his ear about a carriage waiting and a matter requiring immediate attention. Adrian's expression shifted, some careful mask sliding back into place, though his eyes remained fixed on Alina even as he stepped back from her. "I must go," he said, clearly reluctant, "but I do not intend for this to be our last conversation." Before she could respond, before she could even ask his full name one final time, he had turned and moved swiftly through the crowd, disappearing through a side door near the terrace as though he had never been there at all. Alina stood frozen at the edge of the dance floor, her heart still racing, the warmth of his hand still lingering against her own. Around her, whispers had already begun to spread through the ballroom like wildfire through dry grass, though she could not yet understand what exactly they were whispering about. It was not until the following morning, when her aunt burst into her small bedroom clutching a crumpled newspaper with trembling hands, that Alina finally understood exactly who she had danced with the night before, and exactly how much that single dance was about to change the course of her entire life. "Alina, wake up this instant, you must see this." Alina blinked awake, disoriented, the morning sun spilling through the thin curtains of her small bedroom. Her aunt, Mrs. Pemberton, stood at the foot of her bed, still in her dressing gown, her gray hair loose about her shoulders, holding the morning paper as though it might catch fire in her hands. "What is it?" Alina asked, pushing herself upright, her mind still hazy with sleep and the lingering warmth of last night's memories. "Has something happened?" "Something happened indeed," her aunt said breathlessly, thrusting the paper toward her. "Read it. Read it yourself, because I do not believe I could say it aloud without fainting." Alina took the paper with a confused frown and scanned the bold print at the top of the society column. The words seemed to blur together at first, and then, slowly, they sharpened into something that made her stomach drop entirely. The reclusive Duke of Ravensmore, absent from society for 6 long years following the tragic loss of his younger brother, made a rare and unexpected appearance at Ashcombe Hall last evening. Society was astonished to witness his grace dance not with any of the season's celebrated beauties, but with a single unknown woman in blue whose identity remains, as of this printing, entirely a mystery. Alina read the passage 3 times, her heart pounding harder with each pass, before she finally lowered the paper and stared at her aunt in stunned silence. "Adrian," she whispered, "he never told me his surname." "Adrian," her aunt repeated, sinking onto the edge of the bed as though her legs had simply given out beneath her. "Alina, that is the Duke's given name. Adrian Sinclair, Duke of Ravensmore. Good heavens, child, you danced with a duke." Alina felt the blood drain entirely from her face. She thought back over every word they had exchanged the night before, every laugh, every quiet confession, searching desperately for some sign she had missed, some clue that should have told her exactly who she was speaking with. She remembered the strange hush that had fallen over the ballroom the moment they began to dance. She remembered the way the gentleman had rushed to his side near the end of the evening, murmuring urgently about a waiting carriage. She remembered thinking, foolishly, that he was simply a quiet man who preferred to avoid attention. "He deceived me," Alina said quietly, though even as she said it, she was not entirely certain she believed her own words. "Or perhaps," her aunt said gently, folding the paper and setting it aside, "he simply wished, for one evening, to be seen as a man rather than a title. There are far worse reasons for a gentleman to hide his name, Alina." Alina sat in silence for a long moment, turning the thought over in her mind. She remembered his words on the dance floor, quiet and sincere. "Perhaps it is better for tonight that you do not know it. I promise you, Alina, it is not the beginning of a lie." Perhaps he had meant exactly that. And yet the knowledge that she had spent the evening in conversation with one of the most powerful men in England, laughing freely, speaking of her mother and her ruined family without a single ounce of caution, filled her with a mortification so complete she thought she might never recover from it. "He must think me a fool," she murmured, pressing her palms against her burning cheeks. prattling on about herb gardens and old sea stories to the Duke of Ravensmore, as though he were nothing more than an ordinary gentleman. Or perhaps, her aunt said, a small knowing smile tugging at the corner of her mouth, he thinks you the first honest conversation he has had in 6 long years. Elinor did not know how to answer that, so she said nothing at all, though the thought lingered in her chest for the rest of the morning, refusing to be shaken loose. Across the city, in a townhouse considerably grander than the Whitfields' rented rooms, Lady Cordelia Marsh read the very same newspaper column with an entirely different reaction. She sat at her breakfast table, her tea growing cold beside her untouched plate, reading the passage over and over until the words seemed to burn themselves into her memory. An unknown woman in blue. Cordelia knew precisely who that woman was. She had watched them dance the entire evening, had watched the way the Duke's guarded expression softened whenever Elinor Whitfield spoke, had watched him laugh in a way she had never once witnessed in 3 long seasons of pursuing him herself. It was intolerable. A duke of his rank and fortune, courted by every ambitious family in London, choosing to spend his rare public appearance dancing with a penniless girl whose father had disgraced himself years ago and vanished from society entirely. "Louisa," Cordelia called sharply, setting down her teacup with more force than necessary. Her companion appeared in the doorway a moment later, still tying the ribbon of her morning gown. "Yes, my lady." "I want everything you can learn about the Whitfield family," Cordelia said, her voice cool and measured despite the fury simmering just beneath the surface. "Their history, their debts, every scandal, every whisper, every reason that family fell so far from grace. I want it by the end of the week." "May I ask why?" Louisa ventured carefully. Cordelia's smile was thin and sharp as a blade. "Because I intend to remind the Duke of Ravensmore exactly what sort of family he was dancing with last night. And I suspect, once he learns the whole truth, he will find her considerably less charming." Meanwhile, in a quiet study several miles across the city, Adrian Sinclair stood at the window of his townhouse, staring out at the gray morning sky, his mind still lingering on the woman he had left behind at Ashcombe Hall the night before. His oldest friend, Lord Henry Ashford, lounged in a chair near the fireplace, watching him with an amused, knowing expression. "You disappeared rather suddenly last night," Henry said, swirling his brandy lazily. "One moment you were dancing with the only interesting woman in the entire ballroom, and the next, you had vanished entirely, leaving half of London speculating wildly about her identity." "I had my reasons," Adrian said quietly, not turning from the window. "I am certain you did," Henry said, a small smile playing at his lips. "Tell me, Adrian, when was the last time I saw you smile the way you smiled last night? I confess I had nearly forgotten you were capable of it." Adrian did not answer immediately. He thought instead of the way Elinor had spoken so openly about her losses, without a single trace of bitterness or self-pity, simply honest acceptance of a life reshaped by circumstances beyond her control. He thought of the quiet strength in her spine as she had walked away from cruel whispers without allowing a single tear to fall. He thought of the kindness she had shown a stranger's torn hem and a hungry footman, expecting nothing in return, not even knowing anyone had witnessed it at all. For 6 long years, since the day his younger brother Edmund had died beneath the wheels of a runaway carriage on a rain-slicked London street, chased by creditors after a night of reckless gambling, Adrian had carried a guilt so heavy it had swallowed him whole. He had withdrawn from society entirely, convinced that his family's name had become a mark of tragedy and shame, unwilling to subject himself to the pitying glances and hollow condolences of people who had never truly known his brother at all. Last night, for the first time in 6 years, he had felt something other than grief. He had felt seen, truly seen, by a woman who had no idea who he was, who had spoken to him as a man rather than a title, who had made him laugh without even trying. "I intend to call on her," Adrian said finally, turning from the window to face his friend. Henry raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "The girl in blue," Adrian, you know as well as I do what society will say. Her family's reputation is in ruins. If you pursue her openly, the whispers will be merciless." "Let them whisper," Adrian said, echoing the very words he had spoken to Alina the night before. "I spent 6 years hiding from this world, Henry. I have no intention of spending 6 more." Henry studied his friend for a long moment, something like relief flickering behind his eyes, as though he had been waiting years to see even a flicker of the man Adrian used to be before tragedy had reshaped him into someone else entirely. "Very well," Henry said finally, raising his glass in a small toast. "Then I wish you luck, my friend. Though I suspect, given the way certain ambitious ladies of the ton reacted to last night's spectacle, you may need considerably more than luck before this is finished." Adrian said nothing, but as he turned back toward the window, his mind already drifting toward the small rented house where Alina Whitfield lived, he found himself hoping, for the first time in 6 long years, that the world truly did not end where everyone had always told him it would. 3 days after the ball, a carriage bearing no crest stopped outside the small rented house on Corling Street, and Alina watched from her bedroom window with her heart hammering wildly against her ribs as a familiar tall figure stepped down onto the pavement below. She had told herself, over and over during the past 3 sleepless nights, that he would not come. Dukes did not call upon ruined merchants' daughters. Whatever had passed between them at Ashcombe Hall had surely been nothing more than a passing curiosity, a brief escape from the tedium of his own rank, already forgotten the moment his carriage rolled away from the ball. And yet here he stood, in the same plain gray coat, knocking on her aunt's modest front door as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "Alina," her aunt called up the stairs, her voice tight with barely restrained excitement, "you have a caller." Alina smoothed her simple morning gown with trembling hands and descended the narrow staircase, finding Adrian standing in the small sitting room, looking entirely out of place amid the worn furniture and faded curtains, and yet somehow completely at ease, as though rank meant nothing to him at all. "Your Grace," she said carefully, dropping into a proper curtsy, the formal address feeling strange and heavy on her tongue after the easy familiarity of their first conversation. "Please," he said, something like disappointment flickering across his face, "do not call me that, not here." "Not you. What should I call you then?" she asked, straightening slowly, "given that you saw fit to withhold your surname from me until the entire city learned it before I did." A flush of genuine embarrassment crossed his features, and Alina felt a small measure of satisfaction at having caught the composed Duke of Ravensmore off his guard. "That," he admitted, "was perhaps not my finest decision. I owe you an apology and an explanation if you will permit me the chance to offer both." Alina studied him for a long moment before gesturing toward the small settee near the window. Her aunt, with a knowing smile that Alina pointedly ignored, excused herself to fetch tea, leaving the two of them alone in careful, charged silence. "I did not lie to you," Adrian began once they were seated, his voice quiet and measured. "Everything I said that night was true. I simply omitted the one detail I feared would change how you looked at me." "And why did that matter so much?" Alina asked. "That you would risk my trust to preserve it." He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the window, toward the gray London sky beyond the glass. "Because for 6 years, every person who has spoken to me has spoken to my title first and to me second, if they bothered to see me at all. Mothers parade their daughters before me like prized horses at auction. Gentlemen court my friendship hoping for favors or influence. I have not had an honest conversation with another human being since my brother died, not truly. Not until the night I watched you fix a stranger's hem and feed a hungry footman without expecting a single word of thanks in return." Alina's chest tightened at the raw honesty in his voice, so different from the careful, guarded man who had first approached her in the ballroom. "I am sorry," she said softly, "about your brother." "Thank you," he said, something heavy settling behind his eyes. "His name was Edmund. He was younger than me by 4 years, reckless and warm-hearted and entirely too fond of the card tables. I loved him more than I have loved anything in this world, and I failed to protect him from himself. I have spent 6 years hiding from this city because every ballroom, every card room, every street corner reminds me of exactly how I failed him. You did not fail him, Alina said gently, though she knew the words would likely do little to ease a guilt so deeply rooted. Grief convinces us we could have prevented tragedies that were never truly within our control. Adrian looked at her then, something shifting in his expression, some old weight seeming to lift, if only slightly. You speak as though you understand that particular kind of guilt. I understand watching someone you love slowly disappear before your eyes, Alina said quietly, thinking of her father, hollowed out by shame and debt, retreating further into silence with each passing year. I understand wondering, every single day, whether there was something you might have done differently to stop it. They sat in comfortable silence for a long moment, the weight of shared understanding settling between them like something solid and real. When her aunt returned with the tea tray, she found the two of them deep in quiet conversation, and though she said nothing, the small, satisfied smile on her face suggested she had already guessed exactly where this friendship was heading. Over the following weeks, Adrian called at Corling Street with increasing regularity, always in his plain gray coat, always arriving in an unmarked carriage to avoid drawing unwanted attention. He brought Alina a rare volume of sea voyages he had found in an old bookshop near the docks, the very sort of tale she had described to him on the dance floor. He walked with her through the quiet corners of the park during the unfashionable morning hours, when society's elite were still abed, and the paths belonged only to servants and early risers, far from prying eyes and wagging tongues. You are remarkably difficult to impress, Adrian observed one gray morning, as they walked beneath a canopy of half-bare autumn trees, their breath visible in the cool air. I have very little patience for flattery, Alina replied, a small smile tugging at her lips. Most gentlemen believe a compliment about my eyes will excuse them from any actual conversation. Then I shall simply have to try harder, Adrian said, and something in the warmth of his tone made her heart flutter in a way she was still not entirely accustomed to. He asked her opinion on matters most gentlemen never bothered to raise with women at all, questions of trade and politics and the management of his estates, and he listened to her answers with genuine consideration, occasionally challenging her reasoning, occasionally admitting she had seen something he had missed entirely. He told her about Ravensmoor, his family's ancestral estate in the countryside, describing the wild gardens his mother had once tended before her own passing, and the long library where he had spent most of his solitary childhood buried in books. Alina found herself, despite every careful warning she had given herself, falling steadily and completely for a man whose rank should have placed him entirely beyond her reach. But not everyone in London shared her growing happiness. Lady Cordelia Marsh had spent the past several weeks assembling a quiet campaign of her own, dispatching Louisa and several well-paid informants to dig through every corner of the Whitfield family's past. What they uncovered, delivered to Cordelia's breakfast table on a crisp autumn morning in a thin folded letter, made her lips curl into a slow, satisfied smile. Well, she murmured to herself, scanning the contents twice to be certain she had read correctly, this is far better than I could have hoped. The letter detailed the collapse of Alina's father's trading business some 4 years prior, a collapse Cordelia had already known about in vague terms. But buried within the details was something new, something considerably more damning. According to her informants, Mr. Whitfield had briefly fled London under an assumed name after his business failed, evading a group of furious creditors before quietly returning months later, once the worst of the scandal had faded from public memory. It was the sort of detail that, properly presented to the right audience, could destroy whatever fragile reputation remained to the Whitfield family entirely, and along with it, any hope Alina might harbor of a respectable match with the Duke of Ravensmoor. Cordelia folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her writing desk, already turning over in her mind the perfect moment, the perfect audience, to reveal exactly what she had learned. She would wait, she decided, Patience, after all, made cruelty considerably more effective. Autumn deepened into a season of golden afternoons and long, unhurried conversations, and with each passing week, Alina found the careful walls she had built around her heart growing thinner and thinner, until she could no longer pretend she felt nothing at all for the quiet, thoughtful man who had somehow found his way past every defense she possessed. Her father's health, however, had begun to worsen. What had once been simple exhaustion had settled into something heavier, a persistent cough that kept him confined to his chair by the fire for longer stretches each day, and a weariness in his eyes that spoke of a man who had carried shame for too many years to ever fully set it down. Alina watched him grow smaller with each passing week, and though she said nothing of it to Adrian, the worry sat constantly in the back of her mind, a quiet, gnawing companion to every otherwise happy hour they spent together. "You seem distracted today," Adrian observed one afternoon, as they sat together in the small garden behind her aunt's rented house, a modest patch of earth Alina had coaxed into bloom despite its poor soil. "Is something troubling you?" Alina hesitated, unaccustomed to sharing her burdens so openly, even with him. "My father's health has worsened," she admitted finally. "The physician says it is simply his lungs, weakened by years of worry and poor circumstance, but I fear there is little to be done beyond rest and warmth, neither of which we can always afford in abundance." Adrian's expression softened with genuine concern. "Allow me to send my own physician to examine him. Dr. Halloway is the finest in London, and I trust his judgment completely." "I could not possibly accept such generosity," Alina said quickly, pride and gratitude warring visibly across her features. "You have already done so much simply by treating me as an equal in a world that insists I am nothing of the sort." "Alina," Adrian said gently, taking her hand in his, "allow me to care for the people you love. Not because I pity your circumstances, but because I have come to care for you, and your family's welfare matters to me as much as your own happiness does." Alina felt her eyes sting with unexpected emotion, overwhelmed by a kindness so foreign to the guarded, careful life she had grown accustomed to living. "Why," she asked softly, "does a duke concern himself so deeply with a family the rest of society has long since forgotten?" "Because you are the first honest thing that has happened to me in 6 years," Adrian said simply. "And because I find, quite against every expectation I ever held for my own future, that I cannot imagine my days without you in them any more." The words settled over her like warm sunlight after a long, cold winter, and though Alina said nothing in immediate reply, the way her hand tightened gently around his told him everything he needed to know. Dr. Halloway called on Alina's father the following morning, and though his diagnosis confirmed the weakness in his lungs was serious, he prescribed a course of treatment and rest that offered, for the first time in months, a genuine measure of hope. Alina's aunt wept openly with relief, and even Alina's father, usually so withdrawn and silent, managed a small, grateful smile as he thanked Adrian personally for his kindness. "You have given my family something we have not felt in a very long time, Your Grace," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "Hope." "Please," Adrian replied, "call me Adrian, and it is no more than any decent man would do for those he cares for." As the weeks continued, Adrian began inviting Alina to small, carefully arranged gatherings among his closest and most trusted friends, easing her gradually into the edges of society under the protective umbrella of his own reputation and influence. Lord Henry Ashford, who had watched his oldest friend transform before his very eyes from a withdrawn, grief-stricken recluse into something closer to the warm, thoughtful man he remembered from their youth, welcomed Alina with genuine enthusiasm. "I confess," Henry told her one evening, as they stood together near a quiet corner of a modest supper party, "I had nearly given up hope of ever seeing my friend smile again. Whatever magic you possess, Miss Whitfield, I hope you never lose it." "It is no magic," Alina said, watching Adrian across the room, deep in easy conversation with another guest, his posture relaxed in a way she suspected few people had witnessed in years. "He simply needed someone to remind him the world had not ended." Not everyone, however, welcomed Aliner's quiet rise with such generosity of spirit. Whispers had begun circulating steadily through the drawing rooms of London's elite. Whispers Cordelia Marsh had taken great care to seed and nurture at every opportunity, careful never to attach her own name directly to the cruelest of the rumors, yet always present at the edges of every conversation, ensuring the poison spread exactly as she intended. "It is simply extraordinary," Cordelia remarked one afternoon at tea, surrounded by a circle of attentive listeners, her voice carrying just enough concern to sound sympathetic rather than malicious. "A duke of his standing, courting a girl whose own father once fled London under disgraceful circumstances. One does wonder what secrets that family continues to hide." The seed, once planted, spread quickly through the fertile soil of society gossip, and though Alina remained largely unaware of the growing storm gathering just beyond her sight, Adrian began to notice the subtle shift in certain drawing rooms, the careful, measured coolness with which some of his acquaintances now greeted Alina's presence at his side. "Something troubles you," Alina observed one evening, as they walked together along a quiet garden path lit by lanterns strung between the trees, the distant sound of a small gathering's music drifting on the cool night air. "I have heard certain whispers," Adrian admitted carefully, "concerning your father's past. Rumors of some disgrace, beyond the simple failure of his business." Alina's steps faltered slightly, a familiar cold dread settling into her chest. "What sort of rumors?" "Nothing specific enough to concern you," Adrian said quickly, though the careful way he chose his words told her he was withholding at least part of the truth. "I simply wished you to know, should anyone ever raise the matter directly, that it changes nothing in how I feel about you." Alina studied his face carefully in the lantern light, searching for any hint of doubt or hesitation, and finding none. "Thank you," she said softly, though the unease lingered in her chest long after their conversation moved on to gentler subjects. She did not yet know the full weight of what Cordelia had uncovered, nor how carefully the woman had been waiting for precisely the right moment to unleash it upon her. She only knew, walking beside Adrian beneath the quiet autumn stars, that for the first time in years she had allowed herself to hope for a future brighter than anything she had dared imagine before, and that hope, however fragile, felt worth protecting with everything she had. That fragile hope would be tested sooner than either of them expected. The garden party at Lord Ashford's country estate was meant to be a quiet, gentle affair, a small gathering of close friends celebrating the last warm days before winter settled fully over London. Alina had looked forward to it for nearly a fortnight, grateful for an afternoon among people who had shown her nothing but kindness since Adrian had first welcomed her into his circle. She wore a new gown that day, a soft green muslin Adrian had insisted on gifting her, modest and tasteful, nothing like the borrowed blue silk that had marked her as an outsider months before at Ashcombe Hall. She felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, as though she truly belonged somewhere. That feeling shattered entirely within the span of a single, carefully calculated conversation. Cordelia Marsh had arrived uninvited, accompanying a cousin who held a legitimate place on the guest list, and Alina noticed her almost immediately, standing near the edge of the lawn in a striking crimson gown, watching the gathering with the calm, patient expression of a predator waiting for precisely the right moment to strike. That moment arrived just as the afternoon reached its warmest hour, when most of the guests had gathered near the refreshment tables beneath a wide striped canopy, laughing and chatting in the golden sunlight. Cordelia approached with a small, gracious smile, positioning herself directly within earshot of the largest cluster of guests. "Miss Whitfield," she said sweetly, "how lovely to see you looking so well. I confess I have been wondering how your father has been faring, given everything he endured all those years ago." Alina felt a familiar knot of unease tighten in her stomach. "He is recovering well, thank you," she said carefully, hoping the conversation would end there. "How fortunate," Cordelia continued, her voice carrying just enough to draw the attention of nearby guests, "given how difficult it must have been for him, fleeing London under an assumed name, hiding from creditors he had defrauded. I imagine such circumstances left a lasting mark on the entire family." The words landed like a physical blow. Elinor felt the blood drain entirely from her face as the surrounding conversations fell silent, one by one, every eye slowly turning toward her. She opened her mouth to respond, to defend her father, to explain the desperation that had driven him to such measures. But no words came, only a hollow, humiliating silence. "I am certain," Cordelia continued, her smile never wavering, though her eyes glittered with unmistakable satisfaction, "that His Grace was entirely unaware of such details when he began his courtship. One does wonder whether a duke of his standing ought to be more careful about the company he chooses to keep." Whispers erupted immediately across the garden, a rising tide of scandalized murmurs that seemed to press in on Elinor from every direction. She searched desperately for Adrian's familiar face among the crowd, but he was nowhere in sight, having stepped away only moments before to speak with Lord Ashford near the stables. "That is not true," Elinor managed finally, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to steady it. "My father made a mistake, born of desperation and fear, not deception. He returned and faced every consequence honestly." "Of course," Cordelia said, her tone dripping with false sympathy, though the damage had already been done, spreading through the gathered crowd like wildfire through dry summer grass. "I only worry, dear Elinor, that some ambitious families might see a duke's affection as the perfect opportunity to escape disgrace entirely. One cannot entirely blame the suspicion, given the circumstances." The implication landed with devastating clarity. Cordelia was not simply exposing her father's past. She was accusing Elinor herself of scheming, of deliberately positioning herself to trap a duke into marriage as a means of rescuing her family's ruined reputation. Elinor felt the world tilt sharply beneath her feet, humiliation and fury warring violently in her chest. She caught sight of several familiar faces among the crowd, faces that had smiled warmly at her only weeks before, now regarding her with cold, calculating suspicion, exactly the same look she had endured for years before Adrian had ever entered her life. She could not stay. She could not bear to stand there a moment longer, exposed and humiliated before the very people whose acceptance she had only just begun to earn. Elinor turned and fled, gathering her skirts and hurrying across the lawn toward the quiet path leading back toward the front drive, tears finally breaking free despite every effort to hold them back. Behind her, she could hear Cordelia's voice continuing smoothly, already weaving further poison into the gathered crowd's already scandalized imagination. She did not stop until she reached the edge of the property, breathless and shaking, leaning against the cool stone of the garden wall as sobs finally overtook her entirely. Every fear she had carried since the moment Adrian first revealed his true identity had come crashing down at once. She had allowed herself to hope, to believe that perhaps love could truly overcome the vast gulf between their circumstances, and now the entire foundation of that hope lay shattered at her feet. She thought of Adrian's kindness, his patience, the quiet warmth in his eyes whenever he looked at her. She thought of how much he had already sacrificed to court her openly, defying society's expectations, risking his own reputation for her sake. And she thought, with a fresh wave of anguish, of how deeply this scandal would wound him now, dragging his family's name through exactly the sort of humiliation he had spent 6 long years trying to escape. She could not do that to him, she would not. That evening, back in the small, quiet house on Corling Street, Elinor sat at her writing desk long after her aunt had retired for the night, a single candle burning low beside a sheet of blank paper. Her hand trembled as she finally began to write, each word costing her something precious, something she feared she would never fully recover. "My dearest Adrian, by the time you read this, I will already be gone. Please do not think this decision comes from any lack of love for you, for I have come to love you more deeply than I ever believed myself capable of loving anyone. It is precisely because of that love that I cannot allow you to bear the weight of my family's disgrace any longer. You have spent 6 years fighting your way back into the light, and I refuse to be the reason you are dragged back into darkness. Please forgive me. Please know that every moment we shared together, every quiet walk, every honest conversation, remains the most precious treasure of my life, and always will be. With all my love, always. Eleanor. She folded the letter carefully, sealed it with trembling hands, and set it upon the small table near the front door, where her aunt would find it and deliver it the following morning. Then she began, quietly and methodically, to pack what few belongings she owned into a single worn traveling case, preparing to leave before dawn for her aunt's small cottage in the countryside, far from London, far from Cordelia's cruelty, and far from the man she loved more than her own broken heart could bear. Adrian returned from the stables to find the garden party in a state of hushed, scandalized chaos, guests whispering behind gloved hands, and no sign whatsoever of Eleanor among the scattered clusters of people beneath the striped canopy. A cold, sinking dread settled into his chest even before Henry approached him, his expression grim. "What happened?" Adrian demanded, though something in his gut had already begun to suspect the answer. "Lady Cordelia," Henry said quietly, drawing his friend aside from curious ears. She revealed details of Eleanor's father's past in front of half the guests, implied Eleanor herself may have schemed to trap you into marriage to rescue her family's reputation. Eleanor fled before I could reach her. Fury, cold and absolute, rose in Adrian's chest, though beneath it lay something far more urgent, a desperate need to find Eleanor and undo whatever damage had been inflicted upon her in his absence. He searched the grounds immediately, questioning servants and guests alike, but Eleanor had already gone, her carriage long departed down the country road toward London. That evening, back at his own townhouse, Adrian paced his study for hours, his mind racing through every possible way to repair the damage Cordelia had caused. It was well past midnight when his valet delivered an urgent message from his solicitor, a letter containing details Adrian had requested weeks earlier, quietly investigating the full circumstances of Mr. Whitfield's business collapse, determined to understand exactly what shadows might still linger over Eleanor's family before he made his intentions toward her permanently known. What he read within that letter stopped him cold. Mr. Whitfield's trading business had collapsed after a disastrous investment scheme orchestrated by a group of reckless young gentlemen, gamblers who had convinced him to risk everything he owned on a venture that ultimately ruined him entirely. Among the names of those young gentlemen, listed plainly in his solicitor's careful handwriting, was one that struck Adrian like a physical blow. Edmund Sinclair, his own brother. Adrian sat frozen in his chair, the letter trembling in his hands, as pieces of a puzzle he had never thought to examine suddenly clicked into devastating focus. Edmund's reckless gambling, the very vice that had ultimately led to his death fleeing furious creditors on a rain-slicked London street, had also destroyed the Whitfield family's fortune years before. His own brother, the boy he had loved and mourned for 6 long years, was the very reason Eleanor's father had been driven to flee London under a false name, the very reason Eleanor had spent years enduring cruel whispers and borrowed gowns. The guilt that struck him in that moment was unlike anything he had felt since the day of Edmund's funeral, a crushing, suffocating weight that threatened to pull him under entirely. And yet, beneath the guilt, something else began to stir, something fierce and determined. He had spent 6 years hiding from the consequences of his brother's tragedy. He would not spend another single day allowing that same tragedy to destroy the woman he loved. He rose from his chair before the letter had even finished trembling in his hands, calling immediately for his carriage. The following morning, Adrian moved with swift and deliberate purpose. He called first upon his solicitor, arranging to settle every outstanding debt still owed by Mr. Whitfield's ruined business, quietly and without condition, a debt he considered rightfully his own family's responsibility to bear. He called next upon Lady Cordelia Marsh directly, arriving at her townhouse with a composed, icy calm that unsettled her far more than any outburst of anger might have. "I am aware of what you did at Lord Ashford's garden party," Adrian said, his voice level despite the fury simmering just beneath the surface. "I am also aware, Lady Cordelia, that the very scandal you sought to use against Alina's family traces directly back to my own brother's actions. Should you continue spreading these rumors, I will ensure the entire truth becomes public knowledge, including your own campaign of deliberate cruelty against an innocent woman who has done nothing to deserve it. Cordelia's confident composure cracked visibly beneath the weight of his words, her ambitions crumbling as she recognized the very real threat behind his calm, measured tone. "Your Grace, I only meant—" "I know precisely what you meant," Adrian interrupted, his voice cold as winter stone. "I suggest you consider very carefully whether continuing this cruelty is worth the cost to your own reputation." He left her townhouse without waiting for a response, his mind already turning toward the far more urgent matter at hand. He called at Corling Street directly afterward, only to find Alina's aunt standing in the doorway, her face pale with worry, a folded letter clutched tightly in her trembling hands. "She has gone," Mrs. Pemberton said, pressing the letter into his hands. "Left before dawn for my sister's cottage in Kent. I only just found this note upon the table, Your Grace. I fear she believes herself entirely unworthy of your affection now." Adrian read Alina's letter standing right there in the doorway, his chest tightening with every trembling word, every ounce of misplaced guilt she had carried onto her own shoulders for a tragedy that was never truly hers to bear. When he finished reading, he folded the letter carefully and looked up at Mrs. Pemberton with fierce, unwavering determination. "How far is Kent?" he asked, "and how quickly can I reach it if I ride through the night?" Alina stood in the small garden of her aunt's cottage as the first gray light of dawn crept slowly over the surrounding hills, her traveling case still packed beside the door, sleep having eluded her entirely through the long, sorrowful night. She had arrived only hours before, exhausted and hollow, the ache in her chest refusing to ease no matter how many times she reminded herself that leaving had been the right decision, the only decision that could spare Adrian from the weight of her family's shame. The sound of approaching hoofbeats, fast and urgent, cutting through the quiet morning stillness, made her heart lurch painfully before she had even turned to look. A single rider approached along the narrow country lane, his horse lathered with sweat, his coat travel-worn and dusty from what had clearly been a long, hard ride through the night. Alina's breath caught entirely as she recognized the familiar set of his shoulders, the steady gray eyes that found hers immediately even from a distance. Adrian dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, closing the remaining distance between them in swift, determined strides, and Alina found herself frozen in place, torn between the overwhelming urge to run into his arms and the desperate belief that she had no right to do so. "You should not have come," she said, though her voice betrayed her, trembling with an emotion far removed from the resolve she had tried so hard to maintain. "I could not stay away," Adrian said, stopping just before her, his chest heaving from the long ride, his eyes searching her face as though he feared she might vanish entirely if he looked away even for a moment. "Alina, I know the truth. I know everything." Alina's stomach twisted with fresh dread. "What truth?" "My brother," Adrian said quietly, the words clearly costing him something deep and painful. "Edmund was among the men whose reckless scheme ruined your father's business all those years ago. The very tragedy that drove your family into disgrace, Alina, traces back to my own family's sins, not yours." Alina stared at him, stunned into silence, the revelation settling over her slowly, painfully, reshaping everything she had believed about the shame she carried. "Adrian, I am so sorry." "You have nothing to apologize for," he said fiercely, closing the last remaining distance between them and taking her hands in his own. "I have spent 6 years hiding from the world because I could not bear the weight of my brother's mistakes. I nearly let that same fear drive you away from me, exactly when you needed me most. I will not make that mistake again." "Cordelia," Alina began, "the whole of society has already learned the truth," Adrian interrupted gently. "I confronted Lady Cordelia myself. Her scheme has unraveled entirely, and I have settled every debt your father ever owed, not as an act of charity, Alina, but as an act of long overdue justice for a wrong my own family committed against yours." Tears filled Alina's eyes, relief and love and lingering disbelief warring together in her chest. "Why would you do all this?" Adrian reached up, gently brushing a fallen tear from her cheek, his touch achingly tender. "Because I love you, Alina Whitfield. Not the woman society whispers about, not the daughter of a ruined merchant, but you, exactly as you are, honest and brave and kinder than anyone I have ever known. I have hidden from the world for 6 long years. I do not intend to hide from this." He knelt then, right there in the small garden beneath the pale morning sky, and Alina felt her heart swell so completely she thought it might burst entirely. "Marry me," Adrian said simply, his voice steady despite the emotion clearly trembling beneath it. "Let me spend the rest of my life making certain you never again feel invisible in any room you enter." Alina sank to her knees before him, tears streaming freely down her face as she cupped his face in her trembling hands. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Adrian, 1,000 times yes." 3 weeks later, Ashcombe Hall once again glittered beneath 1,000 candles, gold light spilling across polished floors and crystal chandeliers, the very same ballroom where Alina had once stood invisible and alone in a borrowed blue gown. This time, however, she entered on Adrian's arm, dressed in a gown of deep emerald silk that was entirely her own, her head held high, her heart finally at peace. The room fell silent as they entered, though this silence carried none of the cruelty of that first fateful evening. Whispers of admiration replaced whispers of scorn, and even those who had once looked through her now watched with undisguised curiosity as the Duke of Ravensmore led his betrothed onto the very center of the dance floor. "Shall we give them something worth whispering about?" Adrian murmured, a warm, teasing smile playing at his lips as the musicians began the opening notes of a familiar melody. "I believe we already have," Alina replied, laughing softly as he drew her close. "Dance with me," he whispered once more, exactly as he had that very first night, though this time the words carried none of the uncertainty of strangers, only the quiet, unshakable certainty of 2 people who had found their way home to one another against every possible obstacle society had placed between them. Alina placed her hand in his, and as the music swelled around them, every eye in the ballroom watching in open admiration rather than cruel judgment, she found she no longer cared who was watching at all. She had spent years feeling invisible in rooms exactly like this one, and now, finally, she understood that she had never truly needed the room's approval at all. She had only needed someone willing to truly see her. And in Adrian's steady gray eyes, she had finally found exactly that. Their wedding, held the following spring at Ravensmore's ancient country chapel, drew guests from every corner of England, though the ceremony itself remained a quiet, intimate affair, exactly as both of them had wished. Alina's father, his health fully restored under the careful attention of Dr. Halloway, walked her down the flower-strewn aisle with tears of pride shining openly in his eyes, finally free of the shame that had weighed upon him for so many years. Lady Cordelia Marsh, her reputation considerably diminished by the scandal of her own cruelty becoming widely known throughout society, quietly withdrew from London for a full season, though rumor eventually suggested she found genuine happiness some years later with a modest country gentleman who cared nothing at all for rank or fortune, a fate Alina found she could regard with nothing but quiet, generous forgiveness. Ravensmore itself, once a quiet, half-forgotten estate shadowed by years of grief, slowly transformed under Alina's gentle care into a warm, thriving home once more. She restored the wild gardens Adrian's mother had once tended, filled the long, silent library with fresh laughter and lively conversation, and welcomed guests from every corner of society, regardless of rank or fortune, into a home that finally, after so many years, felt entirely alive again. Adrian, for his part, never again hid behind a plain gray coat or a withheld surname. He returned fully to society, not as the withdrawn, grief-stricken recluse he had been for 6 long years, but as a duke transformed by love into someone considerably closer to the warm, curious young man he had been before tragedy first darkened his path. Together, he and Alina became known throughout London not for scandal or gossip, but for genuine kindness, hosting gatherings where footmen were treated with dignity and wallflowers were never once left standing alone in shadowed corners. Years later, when their own daughter approached her first grand ball, nervous and uncertain in a new gown that still felt unfamiliar against her skin, Alina knelt before her, smoothing the fabric with practiced, gentle hands. "What if no one asks me to dance?" the girl whispered anxiously. Alina smiled, thinking back to a night so many years before, when a stranger's whispered invitation had changed the entire course of her life. "Then you shall simply enjoy the music on your own terms," she said softly, "until the right person finally notices exactly how remarkable you truly are. And when they do, my darling, you will already know precisely what to say." The girl looked up at her mother, curious. "What should I say?" Alina's smile widened, warm and knowing. "Yes,